Out of all of Balerion the Black Dread's riders, King Viserys was bonded with his dragon for the least amount of time. So far, there's 3 known before Viserys, but there definitely was a few more that haven't been named in the supplementary lore books. This dragon has more written about him from his 200-year-long life than the king himself, Viserys. We get the coloring pattern being all black, even his fire being mostly black. House the Dragon may be filling in some blanks in the king's backstory, but even in the book all about Targaryens detailing each king's reign, Viserys gets brushed past because his predecessors and successors were a lot more exciting and interesting. The dragon he decides to climb atop of and claim for himself died about a year after the momentous event. A 16-year-old Prince Viserys entered the dragon pit and grew some balls to be a dragon rider. It's pretty curious why he picked this beast out of all the other dragons in the dragon pit, or the ones laying on Dragonstone. Balerion didn't have a master for years, and for good reason. With the added layers to Viserys' character in House the Dragon, it makes me think Viserys had a very different perspective on dragons than the rest of his family.
They are a power man should never have trifled with.
He may have picked Balerion because it was obvious he was dying and wouldn't have to do much flying, but no one would question him of avoiding the family tradition. By the time Viserys claimed the beast for himself in 93 AC, Balerion finally stopped growing. He was already massive, the largest known dragon in the story, but being housed in the dragon pit meant he wasn't free to hunt and roam. Dragons never stop growing, but in captivity, their size is limited. During that first flight, he was sluggish and heavy and hard to rouse, and he struggled when Viserys urged him up into the air. The young prince flew 3 times around King's Landing before landing again. He intended to fly to Dragonstone, he told his father afterward, but he did not think the Black Dread had enough strength for it. Less than a year later, Balerion was gone. The last living creature in all the world who saw Valyria in its glory. That's what makes Balerion so special. The dragon's life was very eventful. He's definitely seen some things. After all of Valyria's history and accumulated knowledge was lost after the doom that destroyed the peninsula, only Balerion remained. He was one of the 5 dragons that migrated with those founding Targaryens from Valyria to Dragonstone. Balerion was young during 114 BC. He was born and raised in the magical Valyrian freehold. We have these older generations of Targaryens named on the family tree, but no mention of which dragon they bonded with. But someone named Balerion after one of the many Valyrian gods, like a couple of the other dragons. Aegon the Conqueror is his first known rider, bonding maybe around 15 BC. Aegon and his sister-wives' conquest kicked off at 2 BC. After 100 years of growth and experience, Balerion was a killing machine. Aegon used Balerion in some fighting over East and Essos before announcing to the other kings of the 7 kingdoms that no one besides him will carry that title while his family's around. Aegon had no reason to participate in those foreign wars, other than prep for leading a war of his own, and he executed his conquest almost perfectly. I say almost because the Targaryens failed to bring Dorne into the 7 kingdoms. A highlight of the conquest for Aegon and Balerion was burning through the fortified stone towers of Harrenhal. This made the entire line of House Hoare go extinct after their defiance. It took a whole generation to build Harrenhal, with thousands of forced laborers dying to complete the largest castle in Westeros. It's still standing in half ruin, looking like a haunted castle with all its melted walls. Balerion was partially responsible for another royal family going extinct in this war. In a battle remembered as the Field of Fire, the rulers of the Reach at the time, before the Tyrells, House Gardener roasted under the 3 dragon riders above. Most other families didn't think it was worth fighting the dragons after seeing what happened to House Hoare and Gardener. The war concluded with Aegon having Balerion forge the Iron Throne out of all the defeated opposition swords. There was still some fighting to be done in Dorne, but for the large part of Aegon's 37-year-long reign, Balerion got to chill and just travel across the 7 kingdoms under Aegon in what's called a royal progression. It's a tour where the king gets to see his subjects, and they're also reminded how large the Targaryens' dragons are. Balerion would live on after his master Aegon, like most dragons do, and be tamed by Aegon's younger son, Maegor, one of the Targaryens debatably living with the infamous Targaryen madness. Maegor went without a dragon for longer than most Targaryens. By age 25, he had been teased that he was afraid of dragons, but he replied that only one was worthy to be his. He was waiting for his father to die so Balerion can be vacant. There aren't many examples of a rider outliving their dragon, like in the case of Viserys. But when a dragon outlives its master, another Targaryen can claim it. Once a magical bond is formed, a Targaryen can't get on the back of another dragon while theirs is still around. They'll be immediately thrown off. Targaryens aren't bulletproof against dragons. The first instance of dragon fights between 2 riders came during Maegor's reign. He forcibly took the throne away from his nephew after the people of the 7 kingdoms were beginning to reject the Targaryens' foreign Valyrian customs. Maegor spent his whole reign fighting the faith of the 7 and his own family. The rightful heir, Maegor's nephew, hopped on a smaller dragon, about a fourth of the size of the now 150-year-old Balerion, only to have its wing torn off by Balerion mid-battle and fall to its death. Maegor used Balerion's power to kill one of his family members and end one of their dragons, then used Balerion to burn down a whole sept in King's Landing, something the Faith would not sit idly by after. But at the end, Maegor would be found dead on the Iron Throne with slits on his wrists, without anyone knowing who was responsible. Their bond lasted 11 years. The Dragon Pit had yet to be completed in King's Landing by this point, though the construction began under Maegor the Cruel's reign, so Balerion flew back to Dragonstone after being riderless once again. A newer bit of lore we get in the 2018 book Fire and Blood was the inclusion of one more master between Maegor and Viserys, a young princess named Arya Targaryen. Her backstory was brutal to read, unsettling just talking about it. For a while, Arya was the heir to Maegor because he had trouble having children of his own. Her place in line got replaced by the old king, and she got pushed out of King's Landing because her mother was living on Dragonstone. She hated this bleak and boring island. Arya always had this rebel side to her character, and one day she just disappeared after not being allowed to return to King's Landing. But she didn't sneak off across the waters to King's Landing. In 54 AC, when she was about 12, Arya flew off on the back of her newly bonded dragon, Balerion, with no one seeing where they went. Of course, the most troubling Targaryen alive in this era would pick the most dangerous dragon. Not only was Balerion powerful, but he's uniquely described as willful. When the suggestion that Balerion may have thrown her off his back came up, it was rebutted with that he likely flew back home to Valyria since no one in the Seven Kingdoms or even Essos had seen them. No one would see them in Valyria, because after the Doom, the peninsula became uninhabitable, with the land being split apart and the waters still boiling from the volcanoes. Even atop of her own dragon, Arya's mother couldn't find her anywhere. Arya and Balerion were missing for more than a year, but after finally returning to King's Landing in 56 AC with a severely ill Arya clinging to the dragon's back, she was almost unrecognizable. Arya was stick-thin, her hair was matted in a tangled mess, and her eyes were bloody. After speaking, Arya collapsed. It was announced that Arya had died of a fever, which was only partially true. The knight carrying her said that the princess's fever was so hot that he could feel it through his armor. She had blood in her eyes, and her body had something inside her. Something moving, the knight said, until the king forbade him from speaking of the princess. Arya's fever was one unlike anything anyone had ever seen. A septon tending to her described her as burning, with red skin and having barely an ounce of flesh upon her bones, appearing gaunt and starved. Swellings moved underneath the princess's skin, possibly searching for a way to escape and causing her a great deal of pain. The septon wrote, "I pray that I shall soon forget some of the things she whispered, and that she often begged for death. She was cooking from within. Her flesh grew darker until it resembled pork cracklings. Smoke came from her mouth, nose, and her nether regions. Arya's eyes cooked within her skull until they burst. When the princess was lowered into the tub of ice, slimy, unspeakable things making horrible sounds emerged from under her skin, one as long as his arm, but the creatures of heat and fire died from the cold of the ice. The origins of the creatures that lived inside Arya are unknown. The septon speculated that Balerion, not Arya, had chosen their destination. Balerion had returned home, where accursed creatures as those found inside Arya now lived. Following Arya's death, Balerion became the first dragon to reside in the Dragon Pit, guarded by the new Dragon Keepers. Studies began on Balerion here. The king made a law after this forbidding any ship suspected of visiting the Valyrian Islands or sailed the Smoking Sea from landing at any port or harbor in the realm. Any Westerosi who visited Valyria would be executed. Balerion didn't return without injury either. Balerion had wounds. The Black Dread, the most fearsome dragon ever to soar through the skies of Westeros, returned to King's Landing with half-healed scars that no man recalled ever having seen before, and a jagged rent down his left side almost 9 feet long, a gaping red wound from which his blood still dripped, hot and smoking. This adventure may have aided in Balerion's decline, that and being chained up in the Dragon Pit. Only 2 things from 56 AC until 93 AC, when Viserys came into Balerion's world, would happen to this dragon. 1. A young prince named Balon smacked Balerion on his snout the first time the boy entered the Dragon Pit. George R.R. Martin's way of characterizing a fearless character. And 2. In 75 AC, the princess Alyssa Targaryen, sister to Balon, was interested in claiming Balerion for herself when it was time to pick out a dragon. The Dragon Keepers persuaded her not to try and claim Balerion, insisting that the dragon had become old and slow, suggesting to her that she would much prefer a faster dragon. The Dragon Keepers feared what this wild Targaryen girl was capable of with something like Balerion. Prince Balon and Princess Alyssa just so happened to be the parents of our very own Viserys and his little brother Daemon. Now, only Balerion's massive skull remains in the Red Keep, a reminder of what the Targaryens were long ago. Each skull next to it would be smaller and smaller. Now the Black Dragon Drogon carries on Balerion's legacy after the species returned to the world a century after Balerion's death.